Great, thanks, Andrew, and morning, everyone. As Andrew said, my name's Aaron Peate, and I'm a planning director in the planning consultancy team. You may have heard in amongst all the wider COVID news that the government, in their view, is undertaking the most radical review of the planning system since the Second World War. A bold claim, typical Boris perhaps, but without doubt there are key changes that have happened and will continue to happen over coming months. As Andrew said, in this presentation, I will sort of quickly canter through those changes, through the implemented and future changes to the planning system, focusing on those aspects relevant to the healthcare sector, but also pause where I think particular attention should be paid to get the most out of the system when planning for the NHS estate and other healthcare facilities. Next slide, please. So, well, most of you will know WSP, but we are the planning consultancy team within, and we used to be Indigo Planning until about a year or so ago when we joined up with WSP. We still do what we've done for the last 30 years, and that's give our clients personalised and proactive planning advice, but we now do it as one of the largest town planning consultancy teams in the UK. Next slide, please. We work across all sectors, but one of my specialisms is working within the healthcare sector. This involves working on estate planning, early pre-application engagement and local plan promotion on behalf of NHS trusts, through to preparing detailed planning applications for new healthcare facilities and hospitals, or negotiating enabling residential schemes on surplus NHS land. Next one, please. So, back in the spring last year, a host of emergency provisions were put into place by government to respond to the pandemic. First in the planning system was to get local provisions in place so that authorities could operate virtually during the pandemic. I'm pleased to say that the planning system continues to operate effectively, if a little slower than normal, which some might say wasn't possible, but they're working. Most councils now have virtual planning committees, virtual pre-application meetings, virtual consultation events, and decision making continues. So, there should be no operational reasons at the moment why you would put off submitting a planning application. Importantly, and as many of you will already know, time limited permitted development rights were expanded to provide emergency treatment facilities. Crown bodies have always had long-standing PD rights for emergencies and separate newer ones for pandemics, and recent amendments have been extended to local authorities and health bodies to support their immediate response to coronavirus. And this right is wide-ranging. It enables development, including but not limited to changes of use of existing buildings and new temporary modular buildings. The rights could be suitable to provide permission for a range of uses, including the use as hospitals, health facilities and testing centres, mortuaries, additional residential accommodation, storage and distribution, including community food hubs. And there's no application process required for this sort of development. And health service bodies and local authorities who are not the planning authority are simply required only to notify the local planning authority of the use of the development on a site as soon as practical after commencing development. These are temporary rights, but have recently been extended until the 31st of December 2021, and now allow 12 months to undertake development for the purposes of responding to an emergency. So I think the main point is to get these emergency facilities up and running quickly and without the need for initial planning permission, and then provide the breathing space to obtain any relevant permissions for the retention of the facilities on a permanent basis. There were also provisions put in for local authorities to extend their consultation periods on the planning applications and EIA during the pandemic. So these will have naturally kind of extended the determination of applications during this time. And finally, planning approvals, whether they're detailed, listed, outline or reserved matters, with an expiry date between the start of the original lockdown in March and the end of 2020 were extended to the 1st of May 2021. We've not seen any plans to push that implementation date back, but things are moving feast at the moment, so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a further extension of that in the coming months. Next slide. So Probably the most high-profile announcement within the planning world, at least, was the government's planning white paper that was published in summer of last year, which sets out the government's proposed ideas for streamlining the planning system. I mean, every government has one, and if you've worked in planning for a little while, you'll have seen a few supposedly radical plans to overhaul the planning system. The key themes of this government, which might be described as wanting a lighter touch planning regime, include simplified local plans that are shorter, prepare quicker, more visual and digitized, and rely on development management policies to set development management policies that are set at a national level. There is also a move mooted to a zonal planning system, where all land is designated as either growth, renewal, or protected. Each zone will be accompanied by guidelines on broadly how much development is possible, with outline permission effectively granted for the principal development on adoption of the plan. Locally prepared design codes are also proposed involving the community and local stakeholders, so that local people will be more involved in deciding what development will look like in their areas. And as you might expect, there's also a further commitment to more energy efficient buildings to achieve net zero targets by 2050. And Barney will come on to say a bit more about what that means for the NHS later. There are also fundamental reforms planned to the community infrastructure levy, including capturing SIL for changes of use through permitted development rights. And finally, in order to deliver on the government's housing agenda, there's a standard method for calculating housing requirements in a local area as a top-down method of distributing the required 300,000 homes a year. And this method has since been worked up further and is now in place. So the consultation on the government's sort of long-term bigger ideas closed in October last year, and whilst we await the next steps on some of the more involved processes, a number of ideas have already been implemented, as I will come on to explain later. Next slide, please. So just before I do, I just wanted to focus on two potential reforms that make a couple of points relevant to healthcare providers. The proposed local plan reforms will mean that all local authorities will need to revise their current plans some point soon. A process that should be now completed within 30 months rather than 7 years. It takes on average to complete. That local authorities will be setting design locally, and that national government will become more important in setting development control principles. And our advice is that the NHS and healthcare providers need to engage in this process as early as possible at both a political and officer level to ensure that their current and future interests are properly reflected. And given the changing importance of different levels of government in policy setting, it may be more necessary than before to maybe engage at all levels, at a national level, at a local authority level, and potentially with local design codes and neighbourhood plans. I mean, they all may impact on your ability to bring forward development proposals. It's very difficult once policy's been set to bring forward proposals that are not in line with the plan or justify exceptions to policy such as the loss of healthcare facilities, even if the LPA are supportive in principle. We would say that even at an early stage in the estate planning process, you should be getting buy-in for key principles of the development and building relationships with key officers and councillors. The key is to be proactive rather than reactive. We've done a lot of work with NHS Property Services, who are well versed in the need for local plan promotion. We've recently represented their interest in the formulation of the soon to be adopted local plan, or London plan, sorry, to try and shape healthcare policies and policies that may impact on their ability to redevelop their sites viably, such as in relation to the requirements for affordable housing on public land. Next slide, please. So the second point I just wanted to touch on was Section 106 and SIL. And I mentioned that there are likely to be major reforms afoot. We've not had the community infrastructure levy long, but there's changes already proposed. The community infrastructure levy may be reformed to be charged as a fixed proportion of the development value above a threshold, with a mandatory nationally set rate or rates, and the current system of planning obligations abolished. Importantly, there's also a suggestion there will be more freedom given to local authorities over how they spend the infrastructure levy. So So whilst any changes are sort of some way off, we suspect, and we'll be working with the current system for now, healthcare provision can be secured through the allocation of SIL and Section 106 funds at this point. Similar to local plan promotion, they require active and early engagement with councils to make the case for investment and release of appropriate funds. And healthcare projects need to be at the top of that priority list. And with the allocation of funds as a matter for the local authority alone, it's imperative that a robust case is made early to the local authority. SIL charges, which are set locally, and items on the SIL list need to be justified with evidence, which could include the identification of specific healthcare infrastructure needs resulting from planned growth, such as GP surgeries or hospitals. The list could also include contributions to wider infrastructure that could include health or reduce health inequalities, such as green infrastructure or cycle paths, providing that local need can be demonstrated. So it's important really that all health organisations have systems and plans in place to set out any healthcare infrastructure requirements, at the earliest stage, and particularly at the time when SIL charging schedules are being prepared or when local plans are being revised. Next slide, please. So, hot on the heels of the planning white paper were amendments to the planning use class order that came into force through relevant secondary legislation on the 1st of September last year. And this is, the government seeking to address the decline of the high street and the impact of internet shopping even before the pandemic by providing flexibility to move between uses with the introduction of a new umbrella use class E covering commercial, business and service uses. So this new sort of umbrella use subsumes use classes A1, A2, A3, B1 and parts of D1, importantly including clinics and health centres. So clinics and health centres were previously D1. They sat alone in D1, and they are now and have been now moved into Class E. So the result is that a property, a bit of land or a property can now move between use as a shop, a health centre, a restaurant, a gym, an office, and a light industrial unit, for example, without the need for planning permission. So that's quite important, quite a big change. Class C is not affected, so hospitals remain in C2, Class C2. And I think this change does present opportunities for the healthcare sector, but also sort of potential problems. Firstly, opens up town centres to a whole range of additional uses, such as healthcare, where it may otherwise have been protected for retail uses alone. Upper floors of offices can now be used for health and medical facilities without the need for planning permission for its use, and vice versa. Out of centre light industrial premises previously protected for employment purposes can now be used for medical and healthcare without planning permission. The National Planning Policy Guidance also sort of encourages the multi-use of spaces and buildings, perhaps with different uses during a single day. And what might be a health centre during the day could be a leisure centre at night, and permission wouldn't be needed for that. Clearly the planning system, hasn't been the only barrier to this in the past, but the market now has the freedom, at least in planning terms, to provide more innovative uses of buildings. I'd be interested to see what it does for property values and rents as a site that could only be a shop previously can now be put to a host of different potentially higher value uses without the need for planning. Will there be more pressure for landlords to up rents or push out lower value uses? Well, we'll see. It's also worth saying that not all local authorities are happy with this change, as it has given them less control over their high streets and limited ability to control existing uses. And we've certainly noticed that LPAs are seeking to restrict new planning permissions for development to limit the movement within Class E, and this needs carefully managing if flexibility of use is desired. Next slide. And this is just a table that summarises the new use classes and the changes, and noting that medical and health services fall within Class E now, along with many other uses that one could utilise and move to without permission, and hospitals continue to fall under Class C2. So next slide, please. So another permitted development right that's been introduced is upward extensions. The government has sought to make it easier and quicker to deliver more homes on existing brownfield sites. So permitted development rights were introduced on the 31st of August last year that allow up to a 2-storey extension to commercial buildings. demolition and rebuild of commercial buildings for residential, and rooftop extension to residential buildings. And these will be applicable to many locations across England. This right, effectively allows, as a matter of principle, the raising in height of large parts of towns and cities, and could conceivably have, a big impact overall on their townscape. Although the principle is accepted, prior approval of the council is still needed. So that it's not a straight acceptance of any proposal. It still needs some prior approval of the council, and there are still a lot of considerations that need to be addressed. There's some sort of question how different it might be to a planning application, but it does pave the way, we think, for other buildings such as those in healthcare, also being used for large increases in height, even if a planning application in that instance is required to achieve it. I mean, clearly a general acceptance of an increase in height of 2 stories, across the board largely, must be helpful when preparing estate plans and strategies for redevelopment of healthcare sites. I mean, although the provision isn't currently worded to apply to medical and healthcare buildings, the reclassification of these uses under Class E, where other uses within Class E benefit from this upward extension right, might suggest that, these provisions will soon be applied to buildings under Class E as well. Next slide, please. So there are a number of other further potential changes on the horizon which are being consulted on up to today, and some of you will have seen them recently in the news over the last few weeks. These include permitted development rights to convert buildings in Class E. So remember, Class E now includes clinics and health centres, to residential subject to prior approval of the council. So the government argue that this will create new housing opportunities in town centres, maybe for those that will benefit from closer proximity to services such as the elderly and those with disabilities, and will bring additional footfall from new residents into the town centres. I mean, others suggest it might simply mean the death of local centres when all existing commercial units are converted into homes. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Prior approval of the council is still required, as is the case in a number of the rights that I've suggested, and they still need to address sort of flooding, transport, contamination, and some other matters, for example. But there's no size thresholds or locational thresholds, and with that, there may be dangers that there will be change in property values and increased rents and pressures to relocate to enable these conversions to residential. It's difficult to tell at this point. And I mean, certainly two provisions that are mooted for the healthcare sector I'm going to come on to next. So these were part of the same consultation as the change from Class E to residential, and make direct reference to the government's national infrastructure strategy and their multi-year funding for 40 new hospitals, as well as the refurbishment of existing ones across England and Wales by the mid-2020s. So the government are proposing 2 measures that will help expedite the delivery of this public service infrastructure. Firstly, the government are proposing to amend existing permitted rights to allow hospitals greater expansion of their buildings without the need for planning permission. So under this right, hospitals can expand by up to 25% of their footprint of the current buildings on site at the time the legislation is brought into force, which is an important change. It was originally on the buildings that were there back in 1948, I believe, or up to 250 square meters, whichever is greater. There is a proposed height limit, but that's been extended up to 6 meters, excluding plant. And the only exception is that the building cannot be within 10 meters of the boundary to protect neighbour residents. So avoiding planning altogether for small and medium-sized extensions to hospitals would clearly be advantageous to delivery. Secondly, for larger hospital developments over 1,000 square meters, the government proposes reducing the statutory determination period from 13 to 10 weeks, not including EIA development, and within this 10-week period, reducing public consultation down from 21 to 14 days. The government also expects LPAs to prioritise post-permission matters such as the finalisation of legal agreements the discharge of planning conditions and any necessary amendments to the consents. I mean, this obviously is good news, you know, and we'll focus efforts into the pre-application stages of any planning application to iron out as many issues as possible before an application is submitted. But it remains to be seen whether, you know, already stretched local authorities will be able to deliver on this promise, you know, without other government priorities like housing suffering. Finally, you know, as part of the shake-up of the use class order, there have been noises about a new use class for retirement housing and communities to encourage greater provision within the market, but no firm proposals have been drafted yet. You know, all of these above rights would need to be introduced via secondary legislation, and whilst there's no timetable for these changes, I would expect these to come into force before the end of the summer. Just next slide, last one, please. So just to wrap up, clearly a lot of changes happening in the planning system and more envisaged. I think all have the intent of requiring a lighter touch and less time spent in the planning process. And this has to be welcomed in the main, you know, but there are likely to be some unintended consequences where the market is left to dictate, you know, the appropriate uses, particularly on sort of high street sites, and this might push out lower value uses such as medical and healthcare in favour of residential uses. In any event, you know, our firm advice is to engage in the planning process, and more specifically the formulation of planning policy, local plan allocations and sealed charging schedules as early as possible. You know, once adopted, it's far more difficult to progress plans that are not anticipated in policy. And also don't forget that the provision of, you know, healthcare is a good news story. So, you know, their need and benefits, and the benefits that arise, you know, locally should always be emphasised in promoting a site or indeed a planning application. Clearly, the government at the moment recognise the need to streamline the delivery of new healthcare projects, and this is likely to result in the proposed measures I've set out to facilitate a faster planning application process coming into force sooner rather than later. So thanks very much.